It seeps into the world like a hesitant breath, pale and uncertain, as though the sky has forgotten how to open its eyes. There is light, yes, but it is thin, strained, trembling at the edges. The horizon holds its color without warmth. The sun is present only as an idea, a memory pressed behind a veil of ash. It is said that those who woke beneath that sky felt something was wrong before they understood it. Not fear, not yet. Only a quiet imbalance, like a rhythm missing a beat. Birds delayed their songs. Frost clung to the earth long after dawn. Breath lingered in the air, refusing to fade. This was the year the sun vanished. Not gone entirely, not extinguished, but withdrawn, dimmed, as if it had stepped back from the world to watch in silence. In forgotten corners of the earth, chroniclers would later write of strange seasons, summers that never warmed, fields that waited and waited, their soil starved of promise, winters that stretched their long fingers deep into the calendar, refusing to loosen their grip. But these records speak softly, cautiously, as though even ink feared to name what had happened, because to name it would be to admit how fragile light truly is. The sky during that year was not dark. That is what unsettled people most. It glowed faintly, a muted silver, as if moonlight had been stretched across the hours meant for day. The sun rose and set, but its path felt distant, disconnected, like a god seen through fog, like a flame glimpsed behind stone. Some whispered that the heavens had been wounded. Others believed the earth itself had exhaled too deeply, sending dust and ash into the upper chambers of the sky. Distant mountains, they said, had breathed fire. Invisible eruptions far beyond the horizon had scattered a fine veil across the world, star-marked and drifting, a shroud thin enough to let light through, but thick enough to drain it of warmth. But these were only whispers. No one could see the source, only the effect. Villages grew quiet, not with panic, but with listening. Stone hearths burned longer each day, their embers guarded like relics. Smoke rose slowly into the dim air, curling and dissolving as if unsure where to go. Hands wrapped tighter around cups, around one another. Children learned early that year how to read the sky, how to sense temperature not by season, but by silence. It is said that people began to look upward more often, not in prayer alone, but in search of reassurance. They watched the sun as one watches a fading elder, hoping for strength to return, pretending not to notice the weakening glow. And yet life did not stop. This is what history rarely tells us. Crops failed, yes. Hunger brushed against many doorways, but there was also adaptation. Fields were replanted with hardier grains. Diets shifted. Communities shared more, spoke less. Time slowed, as if the world itself had chosen restraint. The sun, after all, was never only a star. It was rhythm. It was order. It was the quiet agreement between morning and night. Without its full presence, days lost their sharp edges. Noon felt like early morning. Evenings arrived gently, without ceremony. Shadows softened, colors dulled. The world entered a state of half-light, a prolonged twilight where nothing felt urgent, yet everything felt exposed. In monasteries and temples, candles multiplied. Flames flickered against stone walls, echoing the weakened sun above. Priests and keepers of time debated in murmurs. Was this a punishment, a warning, or something else entirely, a sacred pause? Some believed the sun had not vanished, but turned inward, that it had retreated beyond the visible veil, drawing attention away from the sky and back toward the human heart. Myths began to gather around the dimness like moths. Old stories resurfaced, tales of ages when the world grew cold so that it might remember humility. Legends of celestial cycles longer than memory, where light and shadow traded places not as enemies, but as teachers. Beneath the silence, people listened. They listened to the crunch of frozen soil beneath their feet, to the slow creak of trees stiff with cold, to the way sound travelled farther in the thin air, echoing across fields like unanswered questions. Snow fell in places unaccustomed to it. Where it did not fall, frost settled instead, delicate, crystalline, tracing star-shaped patterns across windows and leaves. Each morning felt ceremonial, each breath a small offering to endurance. Some chroniclers would later note contradictions. The dimming was not uniform. Some regions suffered more deeply. Others felt only a subtle cooling, an unease they could not name. This unevenness troubled scholars for centuries. If ash veiled the sky, why not everywhere? If the sun weakened, why not equally? The footprints in the snow did not align, and so the mystery endured. What we know, or think we know, is that the year lingered. Month after month passed beneath the same muted sky. People stopped counting seasons and began counting moments instead. A warm cup, a shared fire, a child's laughter, unexpectedly bright against the hush. The sun became something people remembered rather than relied upon, and in that remembering, something changed. Faith shifted inward, rituals simplified. Grand ceremonies gave way to quiet gestures, hands pressed together, eyes closed not in desperation, but in trust. Trust that cycles are larger than fear. Trust that light, even when hidden, is never truly gone. It is said that some nights the stars appeared sharper than ever. With the sun subdued, the heavens revealed deeper layers. Constellations once faint burned brighter, their patterns clearer, as if the sky itself was offering a different kind of guidance. Star-marked paths emerged, ancient and steady, reminding humanity that light exists in many forms. Perhaps this was the lesson of the vanished sun. That illumination does not always arrive as warmth. As the year moved on, subtle changes began to stir. Not a return, not yet, but a softening. Frost released its hold earlier in the mornings. Snow melted more willingly. The sun, still pale, lingered a little longer above the horizon. People noticed, but they did not celebrate. They had learned patience. They had learned to live without certainty. When warmth finally began to seep back into the days, it did so quietly. No proclamation, no dramatic unveiling, just a gradual remembering, like muscles waking after long stillness. Fields accepted seeds once more, rivers loosened their frozen edges, color returned, not boldly, but with gratitude. Yet the world was not the same. Those who lived through the dim year carried it within them. They remembered how the sky could change without warning, how dependence could turn to vulnerability, how silence could teach more than abundance. The sun returned, but it was no longer taken for granted. And perhaps that is why the year was never fully explained, because some events are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be held. Even now whispers tell us of that time. Beneath the silence of old records, beneath the dust of forgotten scrolls, the story breathes, not as a warning, not as a prophecy, but as a reminder that the world moves in rhythms deeper than our knowing, that light can withdraw without cruelty, that waiting can be sacred. The chapter closes where it began, under a sky still uncertain, still veiled at the edges. The sun glows faintly, enough to guide, not enough to command, and the earth rests beneath it, breathing slowly, remembering the year it learned how to live in half-light. Perhaps the sun never vanished at all. Perhaps it only asked us to listen, and some echoes, it is said, only reach us when the world grows quiet enough to hear them. Its surface is pale with age, traced by faint lines like frozen veins. No handle waits for the hand. No hinge creaks in invitation. It has never opened, not once in living memory. And yet, it is not locked. It is simply closed, as if it is listening. Beyond this door lies a season that forgot how to end. It is said that when this winter first arrived, no one recognized it as different. The cold came gently, as it always had. Frost stitched the edges of morning, snow softened the fields, fires were lit earlier in the evenings, and people gathered closer, grateful for warmth and story. But then the door did not open. Spring waited on the other side, unseen. Summer never stepped forward. Days lengthened and shortened as they always had, yet the warmth did not follow. The world moved, but the season did not. This was the winter that refused to leave. In forgotten corners of the earth, time slowed beneath a white hush. Rivers learned stillness so deep that even memory seemed to freeze within them. Their surfaces hardened into mirrors, reflecting skies that felt distant, almost ceremonial. Beneath the ice, water continued to move, quietly, patiently, as if practicing a lesson the world had not yet learned. The cold became a habit. People stopped speaking of it as an arrival and began speaking of it as a presence. Mornings opened not with birdsong, but with the sound of breath blooming in the dark. Nights stretched longer, their silence thick and unbroken. The sun rose, pale and distant, offering light without comfort, like a witness unwilling to interfere. History speaks of these years in fragments, a line in a chronicle, a margin note in a monastery's ledger, mentions of shortened harvests, of grain hardened by frost, of bells that cracked in the cold and were never replaced. The records are sparse, as though those who lived through it learned quickly that words were insufficient. But myth hums beneath these quiet facts. Whispers tell us that the cold was listening. Some believed the earth had tilted just slightly, enough to shift the balance between warmth and shadow. Others said the sky had been veiled by dust, by smoke, by the breath of distant mountains exhaling fire into the upper chambers of the world. There were tales of celestial curtains drawn thin, of the sun seen through layers of unseen ash. Yet none of these explanations satisfied the deeper feeling, because this winter did not feel accidental. It felt attentive. Days were marked not by clocks or calendars, but by endurance, by the careful tending of embers, by hands held close to hearthstones worn smooth by generations. Wool thickened. Homes grew darker, quieter, their windows rimmed with frost like sacred frames. Language itself softened during those years. Words were spoken more slowly, as if sound carried farther in the cold and needed care. Silence became a companion rather than an absence. It filled rooms gently, settling between people without discomfort. Snow fell often, but never violently. It arrived like memory, layer upon layer, erasing sharp edges, smoothing the world into gentle curves. Fields slept beneath stone-white blankets, their furrows hidden, their promise postponed. Farmers walked their boundaries not to work, but to remember where the land rested. Ice became an archive. Within frozen lakes and rivers, histories were sealed, leaves suspended mid-fall, branches caught in motion. The world paused, as if held in a breath too long to release. Children traced patterns on frost-covered windows, star-marked spirals that vanished with the warmth of a fingertip. The emotional arc of those years drifted quietly. At first, curiosity, a wondering if this winter was merely stubborn, if warmth would arrive late, apologetic. Then, slowly, a melancholy settled in, not sharp, not despairing, but deep and wide. The cold asked for patience, and patience was given. In temples and humble chapels, prayers changed shape. They grew shorter, quieter, less request, more presence. Candles burned longer, their flames trembling like living things, casting slow-moving shadows that felt almost alive. The flicker became a language of its own. It is said that bells were rung less often during this time. Metal grew brittle in the cold, and sound felt too loud, too sudden. Some bells froze mid-swing, their notes locked inside them, never released. They hung in towers like silent moons, waiting. The winter became a gate, a threshold the world was required to pass through. Some accounts speak of humility learned during these years, of how abundance teaches differently than absence. With less warmth, people turned inward, Stories were told and retold, not for entertainment, but for anchoring. Elders spoke of older winters, older cycles, reminding the young that the earth has its own rhythms, longer than any lifetime. Contradictions lingered like footprints crossing in the snow. In some regions, the cold was relentless, in others, merely persistent. Some saw skies heavy with cloud, others clear and star-filled. Scholars much later would argue over causes, over timelines, over whether this was one winter or many overlapping seasons remembered as one. But those who lived beneath it did not argue. They adapted. They learned to measure warmth not by weather, but by closeness, by shared meals, stretched thin, but shared all the same, by the quiet miracle of survival without spectacle. Imagery from this time feels perpetually moonlit. Even during the day, the world seemed lit from the side, shadows long and gentle. Frozen bells that never rang, paths etched into snow that vanished by morning, footprints that told stories only briefly before being erased. Prayers were stitched into wool, literally in some places, symbols woven into garments, not to ward off the cold, but to remind the wearer of belonging, to land, to lineage, to time itself. The act of making became a ritual of warmth. The winter did not rage, it watched, and in that watching it taught. Time itself felt altered, weeks blurred, months lost their sharp definitions. People stopped asking when the cold would end and began asking how best to live within it. The question shifted, and with it the weight lifted slightly. Then, almost imperceptibly, something changed. Not a thaw. Not yet. Just a softening. Snow melted a little faster at midday. Ice sang faintly at night, cracking and shifting beneath the moon. The sun lingered a breath longer above the horizon, its light still cool but less distant. The winter loosened its grip the way one loosens a hand. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but with a slow release of tension. No celebration marked this change, no festival announced it. People noticed and then returned to their days. Waiting had taught them restraint. When the thaw finally came, it arrived like a sigh. Water moved again, slowly at first, cautiously, as if remembering how. Streams whispered beneath melting ice, soil darkened. The world did not rush to bloom. It listened, the way it had been listened to. The winter left no monument, only memory. And memory, like snow, softens over time, yet even after warmth returned, something remained. A stillness carried forward, a gentler pace, the knowledge that waiting is not emptiness, but a form of presence. Perhaps that is why this winter has no clear ending in the records, because it never truly left. It settled into the collective breath of humanity, teaching that some seasons are not meant to be conquered or explained. Some are meant to be endured with grace. The door, it is said, still stands, not as a barrier, but as a reminder, that beyond certain thresholds, answers do not wait, only experience. And some winters, sacred and slow, arrive not to punish, but to teach us how to wait, until the world is ready to open again. Not as storm, not as warning, but as a quiet gesture from the sky. Pale flakes drift downward, slow and weightless, turning gently as they descend. They settle on rooftops, on bare branches, on open fields waiting for morning. At first glance, it looks like snow, but the air is not cold, the silence is different, softer, as if the world itself is holding its breath. It is said that on the first day the ash appeared, people did not panic. They stepped outside and lifted their hands, letting the pale dust rest on their skin. It felt warm, faintly, like memory, like something that had traveled very far to arrive here. In forgotten corners of the earth, the sky wore a muted color during that time. Not dark, not bright, just altered. The sun glowed through a thin veil, its light softened, drained of sharpness. Shadows lost their edges. Days felt wrapped in gauze, as though the world were being viewed through a dream. This was a time when the air itself carried stories. Far beyond the horizon, In places unseen and unnamed by most, the earth had opened its deep chambers. Mountains breathed, not violently, not in rage, but in long, ancient exhales. Fire moved beneath stone, pressure released itself slowly, patiently, and the sky received it all. Volcanic breaths whispered across continents. The ash traveled oceanic distances, borne on high winds that knew the old paths. It crossed seas and deserts, forests and forgotten cities. By the time it arrived, it was no longer fire. It was dust. Fine, sacred, star-marked dust, each grain a fragment of the earth's hidden heart. People watched the sky with wonder, rather than fear. They stood in doorways and open courtyards, gazing upward as ash drifted like a blessing. Some believed the gods were marking the land, drawing unseen symbols across fields and valleys. Others felt the world was being asked to rest, to pause its endless movement, to soften its grip. Children traced shapes in the ash as it settled, spirals and circles that vanished with the slightest breath. Elders said little. They had heard stories like this before, stories passed down in murmurs, of times when the earth spoke quietly, and only those who listened understood. History would later record strange details. Summers cooled, crops struggled beneath the dimmed sun. Harvests were thin, and the air carried a constant haze. But these records feel incomplete, as if something essential escaped the page. For the ash was not merely a problem to be solved. It was an experience to be lived. Rituals changed during that time. Fires were kept lower. Voices softened. Gatherings grew smaller, more intimate. People spent longer hours indoors, not in fear, but in reflection. Stories were told slowly, deliberately, as though each word needed to be weighed before being released into the ash-filled air. The ash became a blanket. It covered roofs and roads, fields and ruins. It settled into the cracks of stone temples and the folds of abandoned cloth. Bells hung silent in towers, their surfaces dusted pale, their voices resting. Even sound seemed to move differently, absorbed by the soft veil that wrapped the world. Some whispered that the ash was protective, that it shielded the earth from something harsher, something unseen. A cooling layer between the sun and the soil, a reminder that even fire can become gentleness, given time and distance. Others believed the ash was a message, that the earth, ancient and patient, was reminding humanity of its depth, of the vast chambers beneath their feet, of forces that move without haste, without concern for calendars or borders. Contradictions filled the air like the ash itself. Some accounts blamed distant mountains, others spoke of multiple eruptions, scattered across years. A few suggested the sky itself had changed, that the veil was not ash at all, but something celestial, dust from the stars, remnants of a passing body moving silently through the heavens. No agreement was ever reached, and perhaps that is why the story endures, because uncertainty, when held gently, becomes a kind of lullaby. The ash was not violent. It did not fall in choking clouds or burning rain. It arrived patiently, day after day, settling into the rhythm of life. People learned to sweep it from thresholds each morning, only to watch it return by evening. The repetition became meditative, a reminder of impermanence. In temples, scrolls were wrapped carefully to protect them from the dust. Monks copied texts slowly, their fingers leaving faint trails in the ash on wooden tables. Words took on new weight. Each sentence felt like a breath released into a listening world. The sun, dimmed but present, became something to contemplate rather than rely upon. Its light filtered through the veil, creating halos at dawn and dusk. Sunsets lingered longer, their colors muted but deep, like pigments diluted with memory. Where memory fades, the ash remained. It settled into soil, mixing with earth, becoming part of what would grow next. Farmers noticed that some fields, though quiet now, felt richer beneath the surface, darker, heavier, promising in a way that could not yet be seen. Animals moved differently too. Birds flew lower, Herds clustered closer together. Even the wind seemed to change its tone, whispering rather than calling. It is said that during this time, people dreamed more vividly. Dreams filled with landscapes dusted pale, with skies layered and deep. Dreams of mountains breathing, of gates opening and closing beneath the ground. Some woke with the feeling that they had been spoken to, though no words remained. The ash lingered for years in some places. In others it thinned quickly, carried onward by the same winds that brought it. Its presence was uneven, unpredictable. Scholars much later would debate this endlessly, tracing patterns, proposing models. But those who lived beneath it did not seek models. They lived within the veil. Eventually, so gradually that no one could name the day, the sky began to clear. The ash thinned. Sunlight strengthened, slowly reclaiming its warmth. Rains came, gentle and steady, pressing the remaining dust into the soil. One morning someone noticed blue again. Not bright, not sudden, but unmistakable. The ash did not vanish completely. It never does. Traces remained in sediments, in tree rings, in the memory of the land itself. A silent record of a time when fire traveled the world and arrived as snow. The final reflection rests on a simple image: ash melting into soil. What once fell from the sky becomes nourishment. What dimmed the sun becomes part of future growth. The earth accepts it all without judgment, folding it into its endless cycles. Perhaps the ash was never meant to be understood. Perhaps it was meant to be absorbed. The chapter closes in soft silence as the last pale dust settles and the sky breathes freely again. And somewhere, deep beneath the surface, the earth's chambers remain warm and patient, holding other breaths yet to come. Some voices, it is said, only echo when we are ready to listen. The sky is already awake when we arrive beneath it, but something is missing. Above the sleeping world stretches a vast dome of silver and grey, smooth and unmoving, like polished stone. No blue waits beyond the clouds. No depth opens itself to the eye. The heavens seem close, near enough to touch, yet distant in a way that unsettles the breath. Light falls, but it carries no warmth. It rests on rooftops and fields without blessing them. It is said that on the first morning this sky appeared, people stood very still. They looked upward not with fear, but with a quiet confusion, as one might look at a familiar face that suddenly feels strange. The sun rose as it always had, yet it arrived softened, muted, seen through something thin and unseen, like gauze drawn across the eyes of the world. This was the sky that forgot its color. In forgotten corners of the earth, the day felt suspended. Dawn did not bloom, it merely unfolded. The horizon held no promise of brightness, only a gentle, endless pallor. Clouds drifted without shape or shadow, their forms flattened, their edges blurred. Even the birds seemed uncertain, their songs delayed, their flight lower. People spoke of it in murmurs. They said the sky felt wrong. Not broken, not hostile, just altered, as though a sacred layer had been removed, or perhaps added. The world looked as if it were being viewed through a dreamer's eye, softened, distant, unreal. Colors faded from fields and cloth alike, greens dulled, reds quieted. Everything leaned toward grey, and still life continued. The tone of those days was meditative, suspended between knowing and not knowing. At first there was disquiet, a subtle unease that moved through the body without words. People felt it in the way shadows refused to darken, in the way noon looked like morning and evening never fully arrived. Twilight stretched endlessly. The sun hovered low, its path across the sky slow and uncertain. Some described it as watching a memory rather than a star. Light without warmth, presence without power. Language struggled to describe the absence, so people described what was left behind. Faded horizons, washed out dawns, a sky that pressed inward, reflecting the quiet uncertainty of those who lived beneath it. The heavens became a mirror, not of clarity, but of stillness. of waiting. As days turned into weeks, myth began to surface. Some said the sky was mourning. They spoke of ancient stories in which the heavens dimmed in grief, withdrawing color as one withdraws speech. Others whispered of a gate between realms, opened briefly, accidentally, allowing something unseen to pass through, thinning the veil between worlds. Sacred texts were consulted, their pages fragile and dust-scented. In margins and half-forgotten passages, there were hints of veils drawn thin, of celestial chambers briefly exposed to human sight, of times when the sky lost its hues so that something deeper might be revealed. But history, as always, offered only fragments. Records noted strange light, failed attempts to paint the sky as it was, words like ashen, pale, colorless, repeated without explanation. No account could capture the feeling of standing beneath that dome, of sensing that beauty itself had stepped aside. Contradictions rested gently in the air. Some believed the sky had been veiled by dust, fine particles lifted from distant fires, scattered high above the earth where rain could not reach them. Others spoke of smoke carried from unseen lands, its presence too thin to smell, yet thick enough to alter the light. And then there were those who believed the withdrawal was divine, not punishment, not anger, but absence by design, as though the sky wished to teach humanity what it means to look without distraction. During that time, people adapted in quiet ways. Markets grew subdued, their bright fabrics muted beneath the pale light. Artists mixed pigments endlessly, searching for lost blues, unable to recreate the sky they remembered. Painters spoke of a color that could not be found, no matter how carefully it was sought. Music softened, loud instruments felt out of place beneath the colorless dome, voices lowered, songs lengthened, silence found a new respect. The world learned how to live without spectacle. Where memory fades, attention sharpens, people began to notice small things more deeply. The texture of stone walls, the rhythm of breath, the way shadows barely moved across the ground. Without the sky's color to command the eye, the earth itself came forward. Dust on roads shimmered faintly, water reflected silver instead of blue. At night, stars appeared sharper, their light undimmed by color, piercing through the pale firmament like ancient marks. Marked by the moon, nights felt almost luminous. The moon itself seemed larger, closer, its craters etched clearly against the sky. Some believed the moon had taken up the task of remembering color, holding it in secret until the time was right to return it. Children asked questions that had no answers. Why is the sky tired? Will it remember tomorrow? Adults replied with stories instead of certainty. They spoke of cycles older than memory, of seasons not bound to calendars, of skies that change the way rivers do, slowly, inevitably, without asking permission. The emotional journey of that time softened. Disquiet gave way to acceptance, acceptance to contemplation. People stopped waiting for color to return and began living within its absence. The sky, once a backdrop, became a presence, quiet, watchful, unadorned. In some places, rituals were altered to reflect this stillness. Candles were placed outdoors at dawn and dusk, their flames small but resolute against the pale light. Scrolls were read slowly, their words tasting different beneath the muted sky. Breath became a focal point, a reminder of warmth that did not rely on the sun. The sky did not answer questions, it simply remained, and in remaining, it taught. Time passed in ways that are difficult to measure. Months blurred, seasons felt symbolic rather than real. Crops grew unevenly, some thrived in the soft light, others faltered. Nature, too, was adapting. Then, one morning, something shifted, not dramatically, not suddenly, a hint, a breath. Someone noticed it first at the edge of vision, a faint depth above the horizon, barely perceptible. Another noticed it reflected in water, a subtle richness where there had been only silver. The change was so slight that no one dared name it. But it continued. Day by day, the sky began to remember. Color did not return all at once. It seeped back slowly, like warmth returning to numb fingers. Blue appeared faintly at dawn, retreating again by midday. It showed itself briefly at sunset, then vanished, leaving behind a longing that felt almost tender. People watched quietly. No one celebrated yet. They had learned patience. When blue finally breathed back into the sky, it did so without announcement. It arrived pale, fragile, like a promise whispered rather than spoken aloud. The heavens did not blaze. They softened. The color felt earned, not given. And with it came gratitude, not for brightness alone, but for the memory of absence, for the knowledge that beauty, when muted, teaches the eye how to see more deeply. The sky did not return unchanged, neither did the people beneath it. They carried forward the stillness, the reverence, the understanding that not all losses are meant to be filled immediately. Some are meant to be lived with, honored, listened to. The chapter closes beneath that sky, no longer colorless, not yet fully restored. A quiet gaze upward, a breath held, then released, honoring the silence between shades. Perhaps the sky never forgot its color at all. Perhaps it simply set it aside so that humanity might learn how to look when nothing dazzles the eye. Some voices, it is said, only echo when we are ready to listen, and some colors only return when we have learned how to wait. It rises from the earth without announcement, its pillars standing shoulder to shoulder in a wide, patient ring. Frost rims each stone, tracing pale lines along their edges like silver ink. The air is still. Breath moves slowly here, lingering longer than it should, echoing faintly between granite forms that have learned how to listen. It is said that this place was never built to speak, only to remember. Each pillar bears the weight of centuries, their surfaces worn smooth by wind, rain, and the quiet passing of hands. Lichen clings to them like ancient script, green and grey spirals curling across stone skin. In the hush of early dawn, the circle feels alive, not with movement, but with awareness. This is where the cold was written, not as weather alone, but as record. In forgotten corners of the earth, long before ink learned how to hold history, the land itself became the archive. Trees grew rings that thickened and thinned with hardship. Rock cracked and healed, scarred by frost that returned year after year. Monuments were raised, aligned with care, tracking the sun and moon as if to anchor the sky in place. The cold left its signature everywhere. We walk slowly among ruins now half buried, their outlines softened by time. Foundations of stone houses sink into the ground, their doorways framing nothing but air. Breath echoes here, a reminder that sound once filled these spaces, voices, prayers, footsteps pressed into frozen earth. Ancient hands once traced the seasons in stone. They carved not to decorate, but to mark, to remember where light fell, where shadow lingered, to keep faith with cycles that could not be controlled, only observed. Granite became calendar, stone became witness. Language lingers here, even without words. The patience of rock teaches a different rhythm, one measured not in years, but in millennia. The earth remembers even when humans forget. It holds the memory of cold not as trauma, but as texture, another layer in its endless unfolding. As the path winds deeper, patterns begin to emerge. Sacred geometry reveals itself quietly, circles within circles, lines that point toward distant horizons, stones placed with deliberate care, once catching the sun at solstice dawn, now standing slightly askew. The alignment is almost right, but not quite. Something shifted. Some stones no longer meet the light as they once did. Their shadows fall differently now, stretched and misplaced. At certain times of year, the sun slips past them without ceremony, leaving the stones waiting, unacknowledged. Myth stirs beneath this observation. Some believe the world tilted, just enough to alter the dance between earth and sky. Others say the earth bowed, weary from cycles too heavy to carry upright. A few whisper that time itself paused briefly, allowing the cold to deepen, to teach its lesson. No single story remains intact. Scrolls recovered from crumbled monasteries speak of winters that grew longer than memory, of skies that dimmed and seasons that arrived out of order, of rituals held in silence, of fires kept low, of stone circles visited not for celebration, but for endurance. Yet scholars argue. They trace star charts, measure angles, debate whether human error or celestial change explains the misalignment. Their voices rise and fall across centuries, searching for certainty. The stones do not respond. They remain silent, holding their position with unyielding calm. The chapter invites us to sit with that silence, to feel the cold not as loss, but as instruction. Cold teaches restraint. It slows the blood, sharpens attention, strips away excess. In a colder age, people learned how little was truly needed, how warmth could be shared, how time could stretch without breaking. The stones absorbed all of this. They listened to prayers whispered through numb fingers, to footsteps crunching across frost-hardened ground, to bells rung softly so as not to crack in the cold air. Every sound settled into the earth, carried downward through layers of soil and memory. Even now, if one rests a palm against the granite, there is a sense of depth beneath the surface. A pulse, slow, steady, time's deep breath. Tree rings nearby tell the same story in their own language. Narrow bands pressed tightly together, years of scarcity, of slow growth. Then wider rings, hopeful, tentative. The forest and the stones speak to one another, sharing memory across form. The cold was patient. It did not rage. It did not destroy without purpose. It pressed, taught, and waited. And when it withdrew, it left behind more than absence. It left alignment between people and land, between ritual and reality. Where memory fades, stone remains. The sky changed too, subtly, almost imperceptibly. Star paths shifted. Familiar constellations rose at unfamiliar angles. Navigators adjusted. Priests recalculated. Songs were rewritten to match the heavens' new positions. Some believed the sky itself had leaned closer to the earth during those years, listening. Marked by the moon, nights felt longer, quieter. The moonlight traced the edges of stone circles, filling them with pale glow. Within those rings, people stood silently, sensing that they were part of something vast and ancient, something that did not need explanation to be true. Contradictions linger and are held softly. Was the cold caused by volcanic breath carried across oceans, by dust veiling the sun, by a subtle wobble in the planet's turning? Each theory offers fragments, none a whole. The stones keep their counsel. Perhaps the lesson was never meant to be solved. Perhaps it was meant to be felt. In the final moments of our walk, light begins to shift. The sun, low and gentle, touches the tops of the stones. Frost glistens, then slowly releases its hold. Water beads form, sliding down granite faces like tears that do not fall. The stones warm slightly beneath returning light. Not much, just enough. Enough to remind us that even the coldest records are held within cycles, that nothing written in stone is static. Time moves through everything, even rock. A hand rests against the surface. It is cool, solid, unmoving, and yet, beneath it, something stirs. A deep pulse, older than language, steady as the turning of the world. The stone does not speak, but it does not need to. Its silence is complete. The chapter ends here, with touch, with stillness, with the understanding that some truths are not carried by words, but by weight. Perhaps the cold was never meant to be forgotten. Perhaps it was written so deeply into the earth that it would always be there, waiting for those quiet enough to listen. And some lessons, like stone beneath frost, reveal themselves only when we rest our hands upon them and wait. It should be green now. It should ripple with warmth and growth, alive with insects and wind, and the low hum of summer breathing into the soil. But instead it lies pale and brittle, its grasses faded to the color of bone. The earth feels dry beneath bare feet, not from heat, but from absence. The sun hangs above, present but distant, offering light without comfort. It is said that this was the summer that arrived wearing the wrong face. In forgotten corners of the earth, people woke expecting warmth and found only brightness without mercy. The days were long, yes, but hollow. The light stretched across the land like a promise that had forgotten how to fulfill itself. Noon felt like morning. Evenings came too soon, their shadows lengthening as if eager to take over. Summer had come, but it brought no heat with it. At first there was confusion. Farmers touched the soil, expecting it to be warm, pliable, ready to receive seed. Instead, it felt cool, almost reluctant. Blossoms opened late, if at all. Fruits formed small and pale, their sweetness never fully realized. Bees moved slowly, as though the air itself resisted them. People waited. They waited the way one waits for a familiar friend who is late, not anxious at first, just certain that warmth would arrive soon, apologetic, explaining itself. But days passed, then weeks, and the sun remained unchanged, its light distant, restrained, as if wounded. The tone of the world softened. Language moved like a slow wind through dry grass, careful not to disturb what little life persisted. Words like harvest and festival were spoken less often. Conversations grew quieter, more inward. The land seemed to listen, and so did the people. Summer became a ghost of itself. It wore the shape of the season, long days, clear skies, but lacked its essence. A memory repeating without substance. Children played outside longer than usual, but they did not sweat. Fires were lit at noon, not for ritual, but for warmth. The sight felt wrong, like seeing snow in spring or blossoms in winter. Myth rose gently to meet this unease. Some believed the sun was wounded, struck in some distant battle beyond the visible sky. They spoke of celestial conflicts, of a star limping along its path, giving what light it could while healing unseen scars. Others whispered that humanity had stepped out of harmony, that something in the delicate balance between earth and sky had shifted, and summer no longer recognized its role. Sacred calendars began to falter. Days marked for celebration arrived without joy. Festivals felt muted, their songs thinner, their dances slower. The rhythm between season and ceremony slipped out of alignment. Offerings were still made, but with less certainty. Prayers changed tone, becoming less request and more reflection. It is said that priests and timekeepers argued quietly during those months. They traced symbols on scrolls, counted days by stars, searched for errors in their reckonings. Had they misread the heavens? Had they misunderstood the cycle? But no correction restored the warmth. The contradiction between the name summer and the feeling it carried became impossible to ignore. This contradiction became the heart of the mystery. The chapter does not rush to explain it. Instead, it lingers. People adapted in small, human ways. Clothing grew thicker despite the season. Meals were simpler, warmer. Life bent inward, folding itself around hearths even as the sun shone brightly outside. Doors closed more often. Windows stayed shut. Imagery from this time feels soft and restrained. Pale fruits hung from branches, never quite ripening. Long shadows stretched across fields at midday, confusing the sense of time. Rivers ran cool and steady, refusing the lazy warmth usually gifted by summer sun. Even the air carried a quiet weight, as if holding something unsaid. Children asked questions that had no answers. Why is summer cold? Will it remember how to be warm? Adults replied with stories, stories of older summers that failed, of times when seasons slipped, overlapped, or forgot themselves, of worlds that endured imbalance and found their way back, not through force, but through patience. Some believed the earth was resting, that the land, exhausted by cycles of growth and harvest, had chosen stillness. That summer's coolness was a mercy, not a curse, a pause in the endless demand for abundance, a reminder that life does not always bloom on command. The emotional arc deepened into quiet sorrow, not despair, but a tender mourning for what was missing, acknowledgement without panic, disappointment held gently, like a fragile bowl that must not be dropped. There was no urgency, no call to arms against the sky, only waiting, and in waiting, listening. People began to notice things they had overlooked before, the way clouds moved with deliberate grace, the subtle variations in light throughout the day, the sound of footsteps in grass that no longer rustled with insects. Silence became a teacher, showing how much noise warmth had once hidden. Where memory fades, presence sharpens. The sun set each evening in a blaze of color that felt almost apologetic, golden and pink, beautiful but cold. The sky performed its spectacle, yet the air remained unchanged. It was as if summer could still remember how to look right, even if it no longer felt right. Some nights felt like autumn. Cool breezes carried the scent of early decay. Fires burned low, their flames steady and quiet. People wrapped themselves in blankets and watched the stars, wondering which of them had shifted, which had failed to keep their promise. The stars, however, were silent. Marked by the moon, nights grew luminous and calm. Moonlight washed over fields and villages, casting silver where gold should have been. Some found comfort in this. If the sun could not warm them, at least the moon would keep watch. As the season wore on, acceptance took root. Not resignation, but understanding. Life bends. Plants adjusted their growth. Animals shifted their patterns. Humans learned how to live within the coolness, how to find warmth in closeness rather than climate. Summer's failure became an invitation to remember other forms of heat. Touch, firelight, shared breath. The chapter does not resolve the season. It does not explain why warmth never arrived. History later would offer theories: ash in the sky, dust veils, distant eruptions dimming the sun's strength. But within the lived experience, these explanations mattered little. What mattered was endurance, the quiet daily choice to continue. Eventually the days shortened. Autumn arrived without drama, slipping seamlessly into the cool summer as though it had always been there. Leaves changed color without first being fully green. Harvests were thin, but gathered with care. No one was surprised. The final reflection rests on a single evening, a summer night that feels like autumn. The air is cool, the sky is clear, fires glow softly in hearths. The land exhales, tired but intact. Warmth exists now only as memory, as story, as a sensation recalled rather than felt, and yet life continues. Perhaps that is the lesson this summer offered, that resilience is not loud, that survival does not require spectacle, that even when a season forgets its role, the world finds another way to move forward. The chapter fades here, with long shadows, with pale light, with warmth remembered, not demanded. Perhaps summer never failed at all. Perhaps it simply taught humanity how to live when promises soften, and how to carry warmth inside when the sun cannot. Some voices, it is said, only echo when we are ready to listen. And some summers are remembered not for their heat, but for the quiet strength they asked of those who lived beneath them. Not flame, not fire as we know it, but a faint warmth resting at the edge of sight. The sky holds a quiet ember, a soft orange pulse where day leans into night. No smoke rises, no sound announces itself, and yet something ancient is breathing. It is said that this is how distant fire reveals itself, not with spectacle but with presence. In forgotten corners of the earth, people once paused at dusk and felt it. A subtle change in the air, a heaviness that was not fear, but awareness. The sun would set as it always had, yet the colors lingered longer, deeper, as if the sky were holding on to a secret it was not yet ready to release. Far beyond the visible world, beyond oceans and curved horizons, mountains stirred. They did not erupt in fury, they did not tear the sky apart, they breathed, Deep beneath stone and ancient crust, fire moved slowly through hidden chambers. Molten rivers shifted their weight. Pressure found its path, and with each exhale, the earth sent a message upward. Fine ash, invisible dust, warmth translated into wind. The breath of distant fire crossed continents. It traveled where no human foot could follow, riding high currents that knew the old routes, over forests and deserts, over cities asleep and seas marked by the moon. By the time it arrived, it carried no flame, only memory. The atmosphere during those days felt hushed, sacred. The sky dimmed slightly, not darkened, but softened. Light lost its sharpness. Shadows blurred at the edges. People noticed sunsets growing redder, richer, as if painted with pigments borrowed from somewhere far away. Dawn arrived wrapped in haze. The sun filtered through a veil it could not see. Fire, in this telling, is not destruction. It is breath. It is the Earth's heartbeat made visible only through its effects. A reminder that the planet is not still, not silent, but endlessly alive beneath our feet. Language lingers here on embers carried by wind, on particles so small they slip unnoticed into breath and soil alike, on the way the sky can change without announcing its reason. The emotional journey begins in wonder. How can something unseen touch so much? Fields cooled beneath skies, altered by distant fire. Summers softened, winters deepened. The rhythm of seasons shifted ever so slightly, enough to be felt, not enough to be understood. Farmers watched their crops and sensed imbalance without seeing its source. Sailors noted unfamiliar colors at the horizon. Priests adjusted their calendars, puzzled by delays and overlaps. Ancient stories surfaced to meet this uncertainty. Whispers tell us of fire gods stirring in their sleep, turning restlessly beneath mountains that served as gates to deeper realms. In these myths, volcanoes were not threats, but thresholds, places where the inner world touched the outer one, where the earth spoke and the sky listened. Some believed the fire was a warning, others believed it was a blessing, a cleansing breath meant to remind humanity of forces larger than memory. History offers only shards, a note of ash found in distant ice, a layer of dust settled in lake beds far from any known eruption, tree rings that narrow suddenly, then recover, fragments of evidence scattered across time, connected only by inference, never certainty. And so the contradiction remains, how something so far away could shape lives so intimately. This contradiction becomes the meditation. Because distance, it seems, does not weaken connection. The chapter's pacing slows, aligning itself with breath. Inhale, exhale. The fire breathes. The world responds. Visuals soften. At dusk, horizons glow faintly, even where no volcano can be seen. The light feels borrowed, as if it has traveled a great distance to arrive. At night, ash settles on moonlit water, dissolving silently into the dark surface. No ripple, no trace. The moon watches it all, marked by the same pale haze that softens the stars. People adapt quietly. They light candles earlier, speak more softly, notice how the air tastes different. Rituals turn inward, reflective rather than celebratory. The unseen presence of fire inspires humility rather than fear. For what can be controlled when even distance dissolves? The fire's breath does not linger forever. Like all exhalations, it fades. Skies clear slowly, light regains its sharpness, seasons find their footing again, though never exactly as before. The world does not return unchanged. It carries the memory forward, in soil enriched, in stories told, in a quiet respect for what lies unseen. The final reflection arrives without ceremony. A cooled day, a clear horizon, the glow gone, yet remembered. Gratitude settles where understanding cannot. Gratitude for unseen forces that shape without asking permission, for connections that ignore borders, for the reminder that the world is woven together by breaths we cannot feel, by fires we cannot see. The chapter closes gently, with awareness rather than answers. Perhaps the fire was never meant to be known. Perhaps it was meant to be felt, across oceans, across time, across the quiet space between cause and effect. Some voices, it is said, only echo when we are ready to listen, and some fires speak only through their breath. No green breaks the surface, no shoots reach upward, the soil rests bare and undisturbed, its furrows pale with frost and memory. Wind passes over the land, but it carries no scent of growth, only the quiet breath of waiting. This is not the stillness of night nor the rest between seasons. This is something deeper. It is said that these fields chose silence. In forgotten corners of the earth, there were years when the land lay untouched by seed. Not because hands forgot how to plant, but because the earth itself did not answer. Seasons came and went without nourishment. Rain fell at the wrong times. Sunlight arrived without warmth, and the soil, ancient, patient, remained closed. The fields became a chronicle written not in abundance, but in absence. At first, there was unease. Farmers walked their boundaries slowly, boots pressing into frozen ground that gave nothing back. They knelt, sifted soil through their fingers, listened for signs that were not there. Barns stood open and echoing, their wooden ribs creaking softly, as if remembering animals that no longer filled them. Tools hung unused, gathering dust instead of wear. Silence moved in gently. It did not arrive as fear. It settled like a presence, heavy yet calm, pressing itself into daily life. Mornings opened without urgency. There was little to tend, little to hurry toward. The land offered no tasks, only space. Language shifted. Words grew fewer. Conversations softened. People learned to speak without expectation, as though the fields themselves were listening. Prayers were offered, but not with demands. They were spoken into the air and released, like breath on a cold morning. The tone of those days was contemplative, almost monastic. Furrows filled with frost instead of seed, paths hardened, untouched by footsteps. The rhythm of labor dissolved into a rhythm of observation. People watched the sky, the soil, the slow passage of light across the land. Time stretched, thinned, became something to inhabit rather than measure. As the chapter deepens, whispers begin to surface. Some believed the land was fasting, that the earth, like those who lived upon it, had chosen restraint, a sacred pause, an inward turning meant to restore balance after cycles of excess. In these whispers, the fields were not barren, but contemplative, gathering strength beneath the surface. Others believed the land was being tested, that this silence was a measure of faith, a threshold to be endured. Ancient stories were recalled of trials sent not to destroy, but to reveal, of times when hunger and reverence walked side by side, neither cancelling the other. Records from this era do not agree. Some speak of failed harvests and scarcity. Others mention deliberate abstention, communal decisions to leave fields fallow, to honor signs that felt larger than reason. Myths overlap with memory, dates blur, causes remain unclear, but silence endures in every telling. It is described as thick yet gentle, as something that filled the air between buildings, between people, between thoughts. Bells rang less often. Music faded. Even animals seemed to move differently, quieter, as if aware that noise did not belong here. Beneath the silence, life continued, subtly. People learned to live with less. Meals were simpler, portions smaller. Gratitude grew sharper, more focused. A crust of bread became an offering. Warmth became something shared deliberately, not assumed. The contradiction between hunger and reverence lingered, unresolved. There was need, yes, but there was also acceptance. The chapter does not dramatize suffering, because those who lived it did not dramatize it either. They endured, they adapted. They trusted that silence was not emptiness, but instruction. Children were taught differently during those years. They learned patience before productivity, observation before action. Elders told stories not of abundance, but of waiting, of listening to the land rather than commanding it, of honoring cycles that could not be hurried. Night fell gently on the silent fields. Moonlight traced the frost in silver lines, turning the land into a vast, quiet mirror. The stars felt closer then, sharper against the dark. Some believed the fields were listening to the heavens, aligning themselves with rhythms too subtle for human calendars. Marked by the moon, nights became sacred. Fires burned low in homes scattered across the land. Shadows flickered on walls, slow and steady. People sat in stillness more often, feeling the weight of the moment without trying to fill it. Where memory fades, silence teaches. It teaches how to wait without despair, how to trust without proof, how to believe that not all growth is visible. Eventually, though no one marked the exact day, hands returned to the soil, not with celebration, not with certainty, just a single seed pressed gently into the earth. The act itself was quiet, almost reverent. Fingers brushed soil aside, made space and closed again. No promise was spoken, no outcome assumed. The seed rested there, buried but not forgotten. Whether it grew or not was left unknown. The final reflection lingers in that moment. A field still mostly silent, soil cool beneath the palm, breath rising and falling in time, with the land's own slow pulse. The future unspoken, the chapter closes in sacred pause. Honoring the fields, not for what they gave, but for what they withheld. For the lesson of restraint, for the strength found in stillness. Perhaps the silence was never a lack, perhaps it was a language. And some chronicles, it is said, are written not in harvests, but in waiting, only revealing their meaning to those patient enough to listen, not as a storm, not as a shadow, but as a soft thinning of the world. The sky remains bright, yet altered, its light gentled, its edges blurred. The sun still rises, still follows its ancient path, yet it feels distant, as though seen through a layer of breath. Nothing is darkened completely, nothing is broken, and yet everything has changed. It is said that those who noticed it first did not speak of fear. They spoke of quiet. In forgotten corners of the earth, people stepped outside at dawn and paused. The familiar warmth of morning did not greet them. Instead, there was a hush in the air, a softness that pressed lightly against the senses. Shadows pooled gently at the feet of trees. Colors remained, but they seemed to whisper rather than sing. A veil had been drawn between sun and earth. No one could see its edge. No one could touch it. And yet, its presence was undeniable. The light felt filtered, as though passing through layers unseen, as if the sun itself were breathing through cloth. The world looked closer, flatter, intimate in an unfamiliar way. Distance collapsed. Horizons softened. The sky leaned inward, inviting attention rather than commanding it. This was a moment of threshold, a pause between what had always been known and what was now unfolding. The atmosphere during those days was dreamlike. Time lost its sharp divisions. Morning bled gently into afternoon. Twilight lingered longer than memory allowed. The sun hovered behind the veil, present but restrained, like a voice lowered out of reverence. Language struggled to hold this experience, so people turned to metaphor. They spoke of breath, light inhaled and exhaled slowly across the land. They spoke of shadows not as darkness, but as gentle pools where the eye could rest. They described the sky as veiled, not hidden, suggesting something intentional rather than accidental. The emotional journey was one of quiet curiosity. No panic spread, no alarm bells rang. Instead, there was listening. People listened to the way sound traveled differently, absorbed by the softened air, to how footsteps felt heavier, more deliberate, to the subtle cooling that accompanied the filtered light, as though the sun's warmth had been asked to wait. As days passed, interpretation emerged. Spiritual meanings surfaced first. The veil was familiar to those who prayed and practiced ritual. It appeared in temples and sanctuaries, draped across thresholds where the ordinary world gave way to the sacred. A symbol of humility, of preparation, of the understanding that not all things should be approached directly. Some believed the sky itself had entered ritual, that the veil was a sign of reverence drawn by forces beyond naming, a reminder that the sun, giver of life, keeper of rhythm, was not a thing to be possessed or assumed, only received. Others believed the veil marked a moment of balance, that the earth and sky had aligned briefly in a way that softened extremes, a pause between cycles, a breath held so the world might remember stillness. History, careful and restrained, noted only the dimming. Records speak of light reduced, of temperatures cooled slightly, of harvests altered but not ruined, observations without interpretation, measurements without meaning. Myth stepped in where history could not. Ancient stories resurfaced, tales of times when the heavens withdrew slightly to test humanity's attentiveness, of ages when clarity was softened so wisdom could deepen. In these stories, the veil was never permanent. It was a lesson, not a punishment. Scrolls were reread, symbols re-examined. In margins and footnotes, references appeared to thin skies and covered suns, always brief, always unresolved. Contradictions were everywhere. Some insisted the veil was dust, fine particles lifted from distant lands, scattered high above the earth where rain could not reach. Others said it was ash from faraway fires, carried oceanic distances by winds that knew the old paths. A few suggested celestial origins, star-marked dust drifting silently through the upper chambers of the sky. No explanation satisfied all, and so uncertainty was embraced. Beneath the silence, listening deepened. People adjusted without complaint. Work slowed. Days became contemplative. Markets quieted. Colors were chosen carefully, knowing they would appear different beneath the veil. Artists painted softer scenes. Musicians favored lower tones. Even rituals changed. Candles burned longer, their flames steady and reverent. Incense rose in pale spirals, echoing the veil above. In temples, veils were drawn deliberately across altars, not to obscure, but to honor the distance between the human and the divine. The veil taught patience. It taught the art of seeing without grasping. Children asked fewer questions and observed more. Elders spoke less and listened longer. The sky became a presence to contemplate rather than a backdrop to ignore. Marked by the moon, nights felt especially intimate. Moonlight passed through the same veil, silvered and calm. Stars remained visible, though softened, their sharpness eased. Constellations looked closer, as though leaning in to be remembered. The world did not suffer under the veil, it adapted. Plants grew more slowly, animals adjusted their patterns, humans found warmth in closeness rather than climate. Life bent gently, without breaking. Time passed. No one marked its duration. Weeks blurred into months, or perhaps days only felt longer because attention had deepened. The veil remained, then thinned, then returned again, never quite the same from one dawn to the next. And then, slowly, it began to lift. Not abruptly, not dramatically, almost reluctantly. The sky cleared by degrees, light strengthened, though it felt unchanged in essence. The sun shone as it always had, yet eyes perceived it differently now, more delicately, more gratefully. Shadows sharpened, but they were welcomed rather than feared. People noticed blue returning, not loudly, not all at once, just enough to recognize. Clarity returned without erasing memory. The veil did not vanish completely. Traces lingered in story and sensation, in the way people paused before stepping into full light, in the way they remembered how easily familiarity can soften into distance. The final reflection arrives in stillness. The sun stands clear in the sky. The earth rests beneath it. Light flows freely once more, yet something remains altered. Eyes have adjusted. The world feels fragile in a new way. Perhaps the veil was never meant to be explained. Perhaps it was meant to remind that clarity is not guaranteed, that light, though constant, can be changed by the smallest unseen layers. That perception itself is a threshold, one we cross daily without noticing. The chapter closes in silence, a breath taken, a gaze lifted, remembering how gentle the world becomes when the familiar is briefly held at a distance. Some voices, it is said, only echo when we are ready to listen, and some veils appear not to hide the sun, but to teach us how to see it again. There is light now, but it does not rush. It does not blaze or announce itself. It seeps into the world the way warmth returns to numb hands, gently, deliberately, with patience learned through absence. Stone feels different beneath the palm. Skin remembers how to receive the sun again. It is said that this was the morning after waiting, after cold that lingered too long, after skies that dimmed and forgot their color, after seasons that lost their way. This was the dawn that felt earned. In forgotten corners of the earth, people stepped outside and paused, not in disbelief, not in celebration, but in recognition. The light resting on rooftops and fields felt familiar, yet changed, like the return of someone long missed carrying the weight of where they had been. Warmth did not arrive all at once. It settled. It rested on stone walls, loosening frost that had become habit. It touched skin carefully, testing whether it was welcome. The sun rose higher, steady and restrained, as though aware of what its absence had taught. The world breathed out. Streams that had learned stillness began to move again, not in haste, but with quiet confidence. Ice cracked softly, then released. Water found its path and followed it, whispering through channels that remembered its shape. The sound felt sacred, movement returning after silence. Earth softened. Soil that had resisted touch now yielded slightly, darkened by moisture and promise. Footsteps pressed into it again, leaving marks that did not immediately vanish. The land remembered weight, remembered care. Birdsong returned in fragments, at first a single note at dawn, then another, tentative, as if unsure whether it was time. The air received these sounds gently, holding them without echoing too loudly. Life did not rush back. It reintroduced itself. The tone of this time was serene, grateful. People did not cheer. They did not shout praise to the sky. Instead, they moved more slowly. They noticed small things, the way breath no longer burned in the lungs, the way shadows shortened without urgency, the way light lingered warmly on faces without demanding attention. Relief arrived quietly, and then reverence followed. As layers unfold, reflection replaces mystery. Questions that once pressed urgently now softened, becoming companions rather than demands. Why had the light withdrawn? Why had the cold stayed? These questions remained unanswered, and somehow that felt right. People remembered the long pause. They remembered how silence had reshaped their days, how patience had become a skill rather than a burden, how humility had grown not from fear, but from awareness of forces larger than memory. Myths began to speak differently now, not as warnings, but as acknowledgements. Stories of renewal surfaced, of gods who step away so mortals may learn to see, of cycles that require emptiness to complete themselves. In these tales, light does not conquer darkness, it returns to it, completes it. History, quieter and more restrained, noted recovery. Harvests improved, temperatures stabilized, trade resumed its familiar routes, calendars aligned again with the sky. But even in these records, there is a sense of restraint, as though those writing understood that something essential could not be measured. The world had been changed, not scarred, not broken, changed. Contradictions remained unresolved, and that was honored. Some still believed the dimming had come from distant fire, ash and dust carried across oceans, veiling the sun without malice. Others believed the sky itself had shifted, subtly, temporarily, reminding humanity that even constants are held in balance. A few spoke of divine intention, Many spoke of chance. No single voice prevailed. Silence held them all. People carried the lessons forward in small, lasting ways. They wasted less. They listened more. They planned with humility rather than certainty. Festivals returned, but they were gentler now. Songs included verses about waiting. Rituals left space for stillness. Children were taught not only how to plant, but when not to. The memory of absence became a quiet teacher. Even as days grew warmer and skies cleared fully, there was a new attentiveness to light. People noticed its quality, not just its presence. They noticed how it changed with season and hour, how it touched water differently than stone, how it softened at dusk and sharpened at noon. Light was no longer taken for granted. Where memory fades, ritual remains. At the edges of villages and cities, some still paused at dawn, not to ask for warmth, but to acknowledge it. A hand lifted, a breath taken, a moment of gratitude offered without words. The earth responded in its own time. Fields greened, trees filled with leaves that felt richer for having waited. Fruit ripened slowly, deliberately. Abundance returned, but it did not overwhelm. It felt measured, considered, and yet something of the quiet stayed. Even in laughter there was depth, even in movement there was awareness. The final reflection settles as dusk returns. The sun lowers itself gently, painting the sky in colors remembered rather than rediscovered. Gold fades into amber, amber into violet. Night approaches without threat, familiar and welcome. Stars emerge, steady and unchanged. The moon rises, marked by the same calm light that once ruled the sky alone. It watches over a world that has learned how to endure without demanding explanation. The cycle turns. Cold will come again. Light will dim again. Waiting will return. But now the world remembers. It remembers how to hold still, how to listen, how to trust what cannot be seen. The chapter closes with a soft acknowledgement. The sun returned, but the world remembers the year it vanished, and in that remembering something sacred endures, quietly woven into breath, into soil, into the spaces between light and shadow. Perhaps the light never truly left. Perhaps it was only teaching us how to be remembered by it. Some voices, it is said, only echo when we are ready to listen, and some dawns arrive not to dazzle us, but to thank us for waiting.